There comes a time when we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. I think about this quote from Desmond Tutu a lot when I think about the nonprofit sector in America. As a leader in the nonprofit sector, when politics heat up, I hear increasing reminders from many of the most prominent individuals and organizations in the field that nonprofits must remain neutral. I do not agree. Neutrality is much more likely to be a barrier to a nonprofit accomplishing its work than it is to be a fruitful strategy. This attitude in the nonprofit sector is deeply rooted in fear. Today, we'll talk about what those fears are and how nonprofits can overcome them. My first experiences in the nonprofit sector were with advocacy organizations. Organizations that intentionally engage in grassroots advocacy and political action, and that even endorse candidates and ballot issues that mobilize voters leading up to an election. When a nonprofit's mission centers around something that is hot button, something that's a polarizing political topic, the kind of thing that makes an appearance on national party platforms, it's quite common for nonprofits to behave this way. Examples include organizations working to fight climate change, working to protect abortion rights, working to make abortion illegal, working to protect First Amendment rights or Second Amendment rights. These organizations operate within the political space because they see that as that upstream movement. Government policies create opportunities or barriers to the kind of world they're trying to create. A change in government policy might bring about their equivalent of seeing less people fall into the river. At the very least, it might provide easier access so that they can reach more of the people in the river. As I completed a master's degree in nonprofit management, I learned that there are over 1.5 million nonprofits in the United States. And I learned that the kind of organizations I'd been most involved with were pretty unique within the nonprofit area. The most common way for a nonprofit to incorporate in America is as a 501c3 nonprofit, which has a corresponding Internal Revenue Service or IRS regulation that prohibits partisan political activity. The nonprofits that do a lot of political activity, including endorsing candidates for election, are incorporated as 501c4 nonprofits, which give up certain tax benefits so they have permission to engage in this kind of activity. As I expanded my network within the sector, I encountered more and more leaders who felt that neutrality in political issues was important. If you run a hospital, you're going to treat patients with all sorts of diverse political beliefs, and taking a stance that could be perceived as partisan might have a negative impact on your ability to serve everyone. If you run an animal shelter, you want your pets adopted to any family who could love and care for them, regardless of who they vote for when an election rolls around. And no matter what your mission, you want to maintain your tax status and be able to continue operating as a nonprofit. I appreciate not wanting to be overly polarizing. And I do agree that nonprofit organizations should be nonpartisan. I'm not advocating that we change the tax laws that are in place, but there is such a vast array of territory between the complete silence and avoidance of any even perceived political activity and the level of involvement of a typical 501c4 nonprofit organization like the ones where I started out. What I advocate for is that nonprofit leadership really understand what they can do so that they can make an informed decision that won't threaten their tax status. And I advocate that as a sector, we stop letting fear keep us from walking further upstream. We must embrace advocacy and lobbying so that we can make a lasting change in the world and fulfill our missions. Many nonprofits are staffed by experts on some matter that affects the community. A nonprofit hospital, for example, might have some of the most knowledgeable public health experts. A disaster relief organization is likely to have staff with expertise on how to respond when tragedy strikes. Elected officials should want to hear from these experts when they're making decisions about how to govern, what legislation to write, how to vote on something that's coming up as proposed legislation. And nonprofits should want to provide this information because that legislation could lead to better health outcomes for the community or quicker and more effective disaster response, which helps directly with their ability to serve their mission and do more good for the community. There are two activities that 501c3 nonprofits may participate in, and those are advocacy and lobbying. Advocacy is a fancy way of saying educating elected officials and decision makers. Lobbying is taking a stance on legislation. According to the Internal Revenue Service, a 501c3 organization may engage in some lobbying. Too much lobbying could risk loss of tax-exempt status. So how does a nonprofit know if it is lobbying? There's two forms of lobbying. The first is direct lobbying. This is where a nonprofit attempts to influence legislation. They can do this by contacting members or employees of a legislative body for the purpose of either proposing legislation, supporting or opposing legislation, or advocating for the adoption or rejection of legislation. Grassroots lobbying is where a nonprofit goes a step further and urges members, supporters, or other members of the public to also contact those same legislative bodies. The IRS goes on to say that organizations can involve themselves in issues of public policy without the activity being lobbying at all. Examples of this would include organizations conducting educational meetings. They can prepare and distribute educational materials, or otherwise consider public policy issues in an educational manner without jeopardizing their tax-exempt status. So a nonprofit can educate in a nonpartisan, non-biased way, or to some extent even can engage in lobbying. How does it know if it's doing too much lobbying? The IRS offers two tests. One is the substantial part test, and that means just what it says. Lobbying should never be a substantial part of a 501c3 nonprofit's organizational operations. The other is an expenditure test, where a nonprofit compares its spending on lobbying activities versus spending on other activities and stays within some guidelines. If all of that has your head spinning a little, now you come to understand why a nonprofit executive or a board of directors might be a little hesitant to do any lobbying. So I want to share an example of a time that I saw a group of nonprofits do it. A few years ago in my city, a group of citizens and nonprofit partners campaigned to end a ban on pit bulls as pets within the city. I attended multiple meetings and I heard staff of local animal rescues, as well as current, former, and prospective pit bull owners from across the region, speak to my city council about statistics on how many pit bulls are put to death due to lack of shelter space, stories of beloved pets and how they had enriched families' lives, and expert opinions on public safety. To the best of my knowledge, there isn't a line on any major political party's platform that is specific to whether this dog breed should be kept as a pet. For the animal rescues that spoke at these council meetings and that encouraged their supporters to write emails, make phone calls, and attend council meetings to speak, it was clearly a way of furthering their mission. Anyone who is on a mailing list for one of these pet shelters probably likes the idea of passing legislation that could lead to more dogs adopted and less dogs euthanized. The time, energy, and resources that went into this action were not a significant part of the annual work for any of the nonprofits involved. But for each of them, this was a way of getting that pit bull ban overturned in the city that led to better outcomes for their missions. So getting involved in politics for these nonprofits proved to be the best way for them to have success at completing their mission. There was legislation in place, and it was preventing them from best serving the community and carrying out their mission. They wouldn't have been able to endorse candidates for city council during an election, but they were certainly allowed to share their expertise and mobilize their members around the issue. Parallel examples to this could be a healthcare organization weighing in on a proposed change to local laws on which public spaces people can smoke cigarettes in, or environmental organizations that speak up about something like preserving green space or expanding local parks. So the second fear that a nonprofit must contend with once they've become comfortable with these IRS regulations, they've consulted their lawyers and set up their bookkeeping, they must assure themselves that they're acting within these legal limitations. Then they turn to the fear of alienating key constituents. Now, in nonprofits, generally a key constituent is a donor, someone who supports the organization's work. Politics in America right now are very polarizing and divisive. There are some issues that it can be really hard to discuss without feeling partisan because the lines are so clearly drawn between two sides of some issues. For a group of nonprofits looking at a local pit bull ban, that might not be terribly scary. Like I said, everyone on their list probably supports this. There's not a lot of contention there, and there's no party platform that has this built in. But for some issues that a nonprofit might want to lobby for or against, there could be a single political party that solidly supports that issue and an opposite political party that solidly opposes it. And at that point, even if a nonprofit carefully constructs its communications so that they don't mention political parties or candidates, there may be people who are going to read their statements and see those as contrary to their own party's platform. In that case, I say that's the political party's fault, not the nonprofits. We must not conflate values with partisanism or politics. If we describe the world that we want to see, the world we're trying to create, if we articulate our nonprofit's vision and values, and our donors or our stakeholders hear those words, and in them hear the platform of a political party that they don't belong to, that's on that political party, not on us. Our fear of alienating someone who doesn't share our values cannot keep us from standing up and articulating those values. Nonprofits must stop worshiping neutrality and must engage in more lobbying if they want to help the community. Letting go of fear and getting involved is often the most effective way a nonprofit can do the work that it intends to in a community. I urge each of you to think about this. If you have any involvement as a volunteer, staff member, donor to a nonprofit, how can we be more involved? Because that is how we walk upstream and really solve the root of the problems that nonprofits exist to solve. Thank you.